So, can I say thank you very much indeed for coming. This session is on the record, both for the presentation and for the questions and answer, but please don't be too careful what you say. I would like to begin by thanking Northrop Grumman for sponsoring this work. We always like people who pay for things, and to my colleagues in RUSI who have gathered together so many interesting people, that's you, to debate this critical topic. And I'd especially like to thank Andrew Tyler for having taken such a close personal interest in it, for talking about third offset thinking in a way that has galvanized us all, for the pace of emerging disruptive technologies and what we should all be doing about these things for some years to come. So I'd like to thank the co-authors, Trevor, Professor Trevor, and Professor John here sitting at the front, along with Andrew, who has had, I've been watching a huge amount of input into the final result. They haven't been arguing too much, just a bit, just enough to make it fascinating. They're still on speaking terms. That is something after 9 months of research and writing, which has produced an extremely interesting baby. And indeed, they're even prepared to share a meal together, provided Andrew pays for it. So the rules of engagement tonight, very simple. Andrew, Dr. Tyler, Andrew, will set up the problem. He will talk for about 5 minutes. Professor Louth, John, will discuss what we've been doing about the problem in terms of our research approach and activities. Again, he'll talk for about 5 minutes. Professor Taylor, finally, Trevor, will explain the findings of this research and discuss why they matter. And he will talk for about 5 minutes. Yes. And after this introduction from our speakers, I will open the floor to questions, and we will finish at a hard stop of 7:30. There aren't any emergency drills planned, so if you hear a fire alarm, please run like hell. That's not what it is. Please follow the directions of RUSI to evacuate the building. And I'd also like to thank the events staff at RUSI for all of the hard work in bringing this plan and this event together, and for everybody else who has had a hand in this, which is a lot of you, as you will hear. So we are, as I say, on the record. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Conventionally, when you sponsor something, you write a large check and everybody else does the work. Somehow, I wrote the large check and ended up doing about a third of the work myself. I don't know quite how that happened. First thing I'd like to do is to thank James for what has been expert chairmanship of the whole programme of bringing this together over the last 9 months. I'd like to thank RUSI for all of their superb efforts in convening and organising all of the different events that we've had. I would like to hugely thank our colloquium participants across industry, the Ministry of Defence, the Department of Defence, and academia, and there's quite a few of you here this evening, and I truly am very grateful to you for the time and effort and thoughtfulness of your contributions over the time that we spent investigating this topic. As James said, Trevor and John and I are just about still talking. They gave me a present today in grateful thanks for my input, which, if you can't read, is entitled Browned Off and Bloody Minded. I think it's probably fair to say that all three of us have been in one or other of those states at some point during the proceedings. I want to spend a very few minutes explaining why this topic has captivated us so much, and perhaps more particularly, why it is so fundamental to the UK's future defence capability. SecDef Hagel launched the so-called third offset strategy in the US in the autumn of 2014. And in doing so, he remarked, amongst other things, that our continued forward presence has helped anchor America's global leadership for decades with its unmatched technological and operational edge. That superiority has never been guaranteed, and today it is being increasingly challenged. Technologies and weapons that were once the exclusive province of advanced nations have become available to a broad range of military and non-state actors. And it was in autumn 2014 that I, on a flight over to the US, read the CSBA's report on third offset strategy by Bob Martinage, which, for me at least, was, if not the most seminal piece of writing on future defence capability in my time within this business. I'd like to say at this point, that third offset, as defined, isn't really what I would call a strategy. Actually, I consider it to be rather more of a challenge, and perhaps calling it the third offset challenge might have been more accurate. The strategy bit of it, for me, is inextricably bound up with innovation in defence. Deputy Secretary Work picked up the baton and has been instrumental in thinking through the third offset challenge in the US. And in January 15, he said that the United States has relied on a technological edge ever since World War II. We've relied upon it for so long. Now, we still believe we have a margin, but the margin is steadily eroding and making us uncomfortable. We believe this is one of the greatest strategic challenges facing the department. So I guess that poses the question as to why the UK should be interested. And I think there are basically two reasons. The first is that fundamentally we share many of the same potential adversaries as the US. So their challenge is, by definition, our challenge. And secondly, in a peer-to-peer conflict, I consider it highly likely that we will be fighting in coalition with many countries, but in particular the US. And if, therefore, the UK wants to remain a day one fighting nation alongside its allies, and in particular the US, we need to remain relevant to that future fight. And in fact, Deputy Secretary Work in January 15 said it's important that we look at this as an alliance. Each of our alliance members have certain key advantage or certain key things that they are really, really good at. We don't need a lot of duplication. So if we approach this as an alliance and figure out where the technological advantages lie or who is the leader in certain areas, be it undersea technology or mine warfare or advanced missiles, we need to try to work together. We need to be thinking as an alliance about the potential advantage in specialization. And we must all recognize that a fear of the technology gap within the alliance is closely related to a growing resource gap. All of us together need to decide whether this innovation effort is a priority or not. So what this work has sought to do is to validate the third offset challenge in a UK context and then examine the options for the UK in responding to the challenge. The very close relationship between the proposed responses to the challenge and the broad agenda for defence innovation set out in SDSR 2015 presents a unique opportunity to secure the UK's military superiority for the generation to come. I'll now hand over to John to tell us a little bit about how we went about this.
I've got the easy bit. I just talk about research for 5 minutes, so this should be quite good fun. It's always a problem giving a professor a microphone and a captive audience. So I'll try and keep to a normal 5 minutes, but forgive me if I overshoot a little bit, and then you've got Trevor to come. So, this could be something to behold. Andrew's already talked a little bit about the thinkers in this space. And it's true that this is in part located originally in the US. So the very first thing we did was this deep US literature review with people like Jack Gansler, Bob Martinage, Bob Work, the Deputy Secretary, all of whom had published over the past 5-6 years in this space. And what was interesting, for me at least, is that Jack Gansler was a senior official in the Pentagon, same as Martinage, obviously Secretary of Work, and all of them were pointing to the problems of catch-up. All of them were pointing to the problems of smart investment for innovation when our potential peer adversaries are catching up within particular capabilities. And I guess when that is a critique both from within government and from the universities and the think tanks and from the industrialists, then there is something very real and present within this narrative. In the UK, an awful lot of this literature is located in the business schools rather than the defence schools and the international relations schools. And the literature on innovation, the literature on adoption and adaptability is absolutely critical for defence. And we're seeing some really interesting pieces of work now in Shrivenham where our staff officers in the UK are starting to write about innovation through that business lens rather than through the IR lens. And I do commend it to you. I think it's a really interesting body of literature that is emerging from these spaces. Also within our literature review, some really good work in Sussex and King's, Edinburgh, and also with IISS. And I should also say, Stephen Ball's here tonight. You know, Stephen's written extensively on this over the past 5 or 6 years and spoken continually on it at conferences, as have people in Kinetic who commissioned a small piece of work a few years ago with myself and colleagues. So this is a problem and an issue that is bubbling. Andrew spoke about it at the RUSI Acquisition Conference in 2015. Secretary of Work then came to RUSI in the August, September of 2015 and spoke about it again. We then had a one-day workshop here in December 2015, which was opened by Sir Stuart Peach as VCDS and was closed by Secretary of Work, all of whom said, quote, "This work is pivotal for Western defence." Once we've undertaken our literature reviews and we knew that Andrew was going to write a cheque, we organised a number of workshops in November of last year and January and March of this year. We had senior UK military involvement, senior UK officials. The US military involvement was led by 3-star Mike Williamson, General Williamson. A whole range of industrialists, technologists, academics, writers, all of whom participated very freely and openly in that work. And their fingerprints are over this report completely. You know, we've been very clear in trying to capture the themes and the narratives as they emerged. Any faults with it, any errors with it belong to us. Any of the merits do really belong to the people who've been writing about this for the past 5-6 years and the participants in our colloquia. So we genuinely can't thank you enough. This is certainly a demonstration where the communities came together to participate in and enact what was perceived as a critical piece of work. Once we publish this isn't where we stop. How this is enacted and operationalised becomes one of the important questions for defence and governmental reform and defence industrial reform as we go forward. So I suspect we'll be contributing with that. So I'll stop there, just with one quick quote from General Michael Williamson, who led the US delegation to the colloquia. Mike said in an email to me that, quote, "This was the greatest intellectual collaborative activity in my 35 years of active service." I mean, clearly he needs to get out more, but it's a nice thing for him to say. And the final point, of course, is that they immediately retired Mike when he wrote that. So I think we need to be careful. Thank you. Trevor.
I have the task of presenting some of the conclusions from the paper. And the one that I'd like to start with is that really we didn't just take uncritically what was being said in this wider literature, but we do confirm that there's a growing problem, and it's a growing problem not just for surface ships, it's a growing problem for large aircraft, it's a growing problem for uh, land units and so on, very many implications. So we do see there's a big problem there. We shouldn't really be surprised. I don't quite endorse the catching up, but I think what our potential adversaries have been doing is actually focusing on particular areas of perceived vulnerability and putting a lot of effort into that and been very effective. We shouldn't be surprised because we're talking about systems that in many cases were present in Western defence 20 odd or more years ago. We look with, I don't know, a bit surprised. China has a stealth fighter in development. We forget that the United States used a stealth fighter in military operations 26 years ago. So, but there is a problem. It's a real problem, and that's the first thing that we want to emphasize. The second thing is that we need to think about more than just what would happen to Western systems and units in the event of major war. We actually don't want to have a major war. What we want to do is avoid a major war. And that means thinking about deterrence. And when you do start to think about deterrence, I think it's necessary because the emerging ambitions of leaderships in Russia and China, Iran and elsewhere are obviously got ambitions to change the world quite startlingly and in ways that we don't necessarily look forward to. I think the thing about deterrence today is very different from the Cold War. That those my age and my colour hair, we remember deterrence as you had a simple thing really that you were trying to deter, which was a major invasion of Western Europe, and you had a way of doing it, which was to do with flexible response, but eventually escalation to the nuclear level. And these days we've got a much wider variety of threats to address. They're not, some of them are much more limited, and I think deterrence has to be focused and shaped for particular adversaries and situations. China's a very different sort of challenge to Russia. Iran is a very different sort of challenge to China, and so forth. So our broad argument is that we really need now to have some real attention paid to deterrence. It's a very challenging topic, not least because true strategic thinking requires consideration about how your adversary will respond to your next step. It's not simply a matter of deciding what your next step is. So this, we've got to have, I think, more attention and detailed thinking paid to deterrence. The other part, of course, the problem part is there. The solution part is largely, as my colleagues have said, about innovation. And the UK has endorsed the American emphasis on the need for accelerated innovation. And obviously the increased funding for innovation in the UK Defence Innovation Initiative is very welcome. We have to put that in the context of the really quite stark reduction in development money that we've seen in the UK since 1990 in real terms, but even since 2000, very sharp drop in money that's been provided for development. So that there is a financial issue. But more broadly, we think that we recognise that innovation requires more than money. It requires a culture that's supportive. And money's not enough. Now, to a significant degree, the MOD has recognised this in its principles for innovation. And we would like to underline many of those. But a supportive culture is needed across the defence enterprise as we define it, which is obviously much more than government. That has to include a risk appetite that can tolerate failure, because innovation is about exploration and experimentation, and sometimes that doesn't work. And so we need a risk appetite that can tolerate failure. And I put in my little talk here, Parliament and the press, please note, because it's not just the defence establishment, it's also those that hold it to account that need to have this in mind. Innovation in defence that can keep up with the commercial world requires a capacity for rapid decision making. Now that has a lot of implications for the procurement processes that we use and the whole acquisition process. And is that capable of going as quickly as innovation might demand? It also requires, when you go into the domain of innovation, you also open up the possibility of the need for disruption to your organization. Things that were important in the past become less so, and things that were unimportant become more so, and you need different trades and so on, organizational disruption. Now, we need to bear in mind that excessive, I'm looking at the Vice Chief of Defence Staff here, excessive military conservatism has a history, and it may not be entirely extinct. So when we talk about an innovation culture, it's got to be one that's ready to accept risk, ready to accept a degree of failure, and also ready to face up to the need for disruption. We believe quite strongly that innovation to yield rapid change has got a much better chance of getting that agility if there are stronger partnerships between the private sector and the government. And I think this is just a matter of thinking, what's the expertise on both sides? What do they both know about? And what are the chances of them succeeding in rapid innovation if they don't share that expertise in a cooperative way and look at each other in an adversarial manner? And I just put that question to you. So we argue that in the defence enterprise we need more partnerships. We suggest a programmatic or even a portfolio approach to technological innovation, with the MOD exploring a range of technologies but balancing its efforts against items that are basically low, medium and high technology readiness levels. So you take a few high-risk bets and you take more low-risk bets. Globally, we know that research and development spending in the civil commercial world is much higher than it is in defence across the world. That's a novelty I don't think has ever been the case before. It's probably about 90% of R&D is commercial, civil R&D, about 10% is defence. Now, a lot of that commercial technology is going to be available to our adversaries because it's commercial technology. So the challenge on the UK is to exploit that commercial technology, but also add to something from military specialist area that can actually give our forces the edge. That's the challenge. In terms of the current risks, you'll find in the paper that there's a structural approach where we offer a four-pronged approach, where we can look at a threat to a capability and we can say, well, we can live with that, we can tolerate it. If it's not tolerable, it may be treated. And treat we use to talk about rapid innovation at modest cost and the significant exploitation of existing assets, but perhaps in different ways. This is essentially the focus of the Strategic Capabilities Office in the United States, and it's one that we very much endorse. Thirdly, we can look for transformational innovation, where cost and risk are clearly more central, and therefore working with other like-minded states might perhaps become a more serious consideration. Finally, you have to recognize that we might want to terminate an unavoidably vulnerable capability, unless it's judged that it's got an unavoidable, it's got major uses outside the context of the major confrontations that we're talking about in this paper. In this paper, we're not talking about peace support, we're not talking about counterinsurgency, we're talking about dealing with other sovereign states that may confront us. Overall, these things have to be set in the context of UK defence policy and UK ambition for autonomy, whether, as Andrew mentioned at the beginning, if the UK wants to remain a day one player with the United States, what about our military role in the Middle East? What about any military role in East Asia? All those sorts of questions are going to colour what particular responses we should make to the kind of challenges that our adversaries, potential adversaries, are presenting us to. So there is a defence policy item on this agenda that comes out of this issue. Overall, we deliberately did not seek to produce a paper that said this is what the MOD must do, point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That was not what we wanted to do. What we wanted to do, I think, is obviously come up with some ideas, but very much set an agenda, as I've tried to outline just now. if you like, that we confront the real things that are there rather than ignoring them and hoping that they're going to go away. So while the paper starts by underlining the changing capabilities of potential adversaries, it develops into quite a broad risk of topics, not least innovation and an innovation culture in the context of deterring potential state adversaries. We believe that these things are things that the Ministry of Defence, but actually government as a whole and across the defence enterprise, should get serious attention. And with that, we open ourselves up to the dangerous part of the exercise, which is questions. Thank you.
Right, now it's your turn to do the work. And who would like to ask the first question? Can I ask you please to tell us who you are and which organisation you come from? No questions? Right, then we can... Deborah, who are you? Deborah Haynes from the Times. Thank you.
Thank you. I was really interested in, the report, and particularly the figures that you sort of bring out about the investment in R&D and that number for the innovation fund, kind of like 80 million pounds a year compared with 86 billion over 10 years. It was a really sort of stark, 1% of the sort of defence budget is in innovation. And what does that tell you? Has the government got its priorities right in SDSR 2015? And then the second question, you did talk about the 4 T's, and you explained them, but I'd be interested to hear what capabilities you think could be terminated.
That's an easy question.
Have we sorted out the feedback? Great, thank you. Who would like to begin? Trevor would like to begin.
I think the Defence Innovation Initiative money, which I think is 800 million over a decade, and is going to build up, and that's an encouraging signal, and it shows, if you like, recognition of the problem. It's clearly not enough to solve any problem. What that money can achieve is open up some opportunities. It actually also has the effect of should have the effect of making the UK a more intelligent customer in terms of looking at what other people may offer and being able to assess that. But I think, I'm quite clear that unless something can be done to boost the money in the development phase, for the development phase of projects, that the valley of death, as it's called, is still a real issue. And the implication, we do have to look at how that development, the levels of development spending can be boosted somewhat. The contrast, which is in the evidence I gave to the Defence Committee, it's not in this, which is in this paper, but between what we were spending in 1990 and 2003 and what we're spending now on development projects is really quite stark, and that I think is a worrying problem.
I was just minded when Deborah was asking the question that Peter Luff, who's not here this evening, but I'm sure he won't mind me saying, when Peter was Minister, he would talk a little bit about the importance of signalling, so that not everything is exactly as presented, but the signalling was an important characteristic of large complex organisations. So the signal of something even labelled innovation fund for me is a very positive thing. But I think it's how it's used to leverage into the monies that are available. So how that 80 cracks into the 400 million sort of S&T 1.2%, how that in turn breaks into what will effectively be a 18 billion pound a year equipment line, and much more significantly now how those monies then break into the billions to a power unknown of research and development monies within the private sector, with partners that we know and folk within our supply chains that we're only just beginning to understand or perhaps even acknowledge exists. So how those things come together is what's critical. And our work and our report talks about how an innovation culture isn't a badge that an organisation can deliver on demand. It has to live it. It's more akin to, I think we use the phrase, it's more like an organism than a machine. And I think there's some truth in that, and in part it is relationship derived. And to take the last part of the question head on, what capabilities should be terminated, I don't know. I suspect very few people in this room know what shouldn't go forward or what should stop. What we do know, though, I suspect, is that we articulate the need for change continually. So the need for change, the need to adapt, the need to reflect on new financial realities, the need to reflect the challenges of our potential adversaries, all sort of impact upon the way we conceptualise defence in the UK and with our partners. There's absolutely no reason to be scared of change of capabilities itself. I mean, that's intellectually strange. We're committed to things for sure, but if we value innovation and we value the benefits of change and the benefits of adaptability, then stopping things and doing other things seems inherently sensible and right. And that must move into big things and shiny things. I mean, that's just the logic of the position we've adopted.
I'll just add a few things to what John's just said about your last and most difficult question, whilst neatly avoiding the specificity. I mean, you can go back through the entire history of warfare and find that capabilities have come and gone. They've had their day, they've been very effective at a particular point in history, and then in a sense, in probably what has actually been many offsets through the course of military history, they have become less effective against the peer adversary of the day, and they've been substituted for something else that's more effective. And given we're not in a situation of unconstrained resources, you're always going to have to balance where you put your money. I think the decision around the capability portfolio is absolutely one for the MOD, and it needs, as I think the MOD has always done, to be treated very thoughtfully. I think what we did in the paper here was to suggest, let's say, considerations that one will be giving in thinking through this. The first one was really to point out, and I think Trevor emphasised when he talked earlier, that this whole piece of work is around peer-to-peer adversaries and contested environments. And so there are plenty of capabilities that have utility in CT or COIN operations, but may not have the relevance in a peer adversary situation. That doesn't make them a lesser capability. The second is that the circumstance where you might have the ability to rapidly reconstitute something. So you might give something up on the basis that if a certain set of circumstances presented, you could reconstitute it. The quote I gave earlier from Deputy Secretary Work about when he was talking about alliances, saying we need to be thinking as an alliance about the potential advantage in specialisation. So giving something up doesn't necessarily mean you're giving it up if you're operating in coalition and you've got different partners playing to their strengths and bringing different capabilities to the fight. But I think at the end of the day, it does come down, unfortunately and inevitably, to balance of priorities and then the resources that you have against those priorities. And I said, over time, you would expect to see evolution in your capability set reflecting the change in your threat environment. So as John said, this is nothing to be ashamed about. It's nothing that should be considered politically unacceptable. In fact, if anything, it should be something that's hugely applauded.
I'm going to call Paul next, but you'll still have to say who you are and where you're from, and after that VCDS, but the same thing. But before I do, I just want to say that termination. I remember the Defence Committee writing its report on FRES, the Future Rapid Effects System, and we really enjoyed writing that report. And maybe we enjoyed writing that report just a little bit too much. because it ought to be easy, provided possibly you cancel a piece of equipment after rather fewer years than 13 perhaps. That would be good, but it ought to be possible to cancel early, because that's what private industry does. Paul, who are you?
Yes, I'm Paul Ingram. I'm director of the British American Security Information Council, BASIC. I think Deborah really hit it on the head when she talked about what you give up in order to innovate. And I understand the reticence about naming things. I understand that. But I wonder if there's something that can be said about the quality or the nature of technologies as they move forward. I mean, are we talking, for example, in innovation about things that are small, numerous, cheap, networked, etc.? What are the qualities of the technology that we're talking about? And my second question, I guess, which is related, is what is it that gets in the way of technology? Trevor very accurately described the problems around failure, because failure is learning. And if individuals are harmed because they fail, then there is a major disincentive within the system, even if the whole system requires failure. If we punish individuals, then failure is not going to happen and there isn't going to be innovation. And this is more than throwing money at it. It's about culture shift. But I think there are other things that get in the way. I used to teach systems to senior civil servants, and one of the things I used to teach was the concept of immunity to change. We might want something. We want innovation. It's a good thing. But what is it that gets in the way? And that's actually more important than the wanting innovation, in a sense. And it strikes me that there's a whole bunch of things that get in the way. And it's nobody's fault. It's a system's fault. But if we have true leadership, then we need to overcome those barriers to innovation.
I'll just say something very briefly on your last point about and it's an observation, I guess, that I can make a little bit better than some, because I spent time operating in the public sector, but also time in the private sector, quite a good chunk of my career in both. And I think that you have to the point that was being made earlier, you actually have to get down to the root of the way that organisations are held to account. And if I look at the way I felt I was being held to account in the Ministry of Defence, it was in a very different way to the way I feel I'm being held to account in a commercial company. And I think that goes to the root of the stakeholders to your organisation. I'll say that in the public sector, I think it's in many respects, a far more complicated situation. Your stakeholders are far more complex. They're much broader. They are, on average, maybe less well informed in the broadest sense. And they also have a lot of other extraneous pressures on them, which mean that they see what your actions through often a lens that's very different to the one that you see them through yourselves. In industry, principally your shareholders are your principal shareholder stakeholders in a risk-taking sense, and they knowingly buy your stock with a certain risk profile to your company, and in doing so they overtly and explicitly take a risk. They know that you, as a company of a certain type, will do certain activities. If it happens to be a company that has a greater risk profile, they know by definition that some things that you do will fail, and that's basically the intrinsic deal that you do between a company and its shareholders. And so I think you are in an environment in a commercial organisation that's perhaps finds it easier to follow those sort of principles that we all know are correct, that if you are going to push the envelope, that means you're going to be taking risks, and therefore statistically failure is going to be a part of everyday life, and you don't want to encourage failure, but you want to encourage a positive attitude to failure. And I would say there's quite a stark difference between the private and the public sector in that broad sense.
Maybe we're all struggling strenuously to agree with each other. I don't know. Is there anything you want to add? Or you don't have to, because there are plenty of people who want to.
The question of technology is an interesting one, and I think it's a mixture. and there's some. I mean, the original third offset strategy was as Andrew said at the beginning, was a challenge. It said, it said, here's a problem, and we Americans are very good at innovation, so we'll be able to deal with it. But and there were some routes, methods of doing that outlined. But I mean, the whole you've got a contrast to a certain way, because everybody here is very familiar with the cyber challenges that exist, and some people want to take the military a bit so they're less dependent on high-tech information systems. Do you teach soldiers to navigate without their phones? And another, but a lot of the Bob Work is very keen on even enhanced use of information in order to secure the kind of transfer. So he's thinking about artificial intelligence and linking all that together. There are some, I think it's quite obvious that laser technology, electric railguns, those sorts of things that that have the potential to protect large things against a number of flying objects coming at them. Perhaps that's one of the things we didn't emphasize. But the challenge that we see is not just incoming, it's that somebody can cheerfully fire 20 incoming and not have spent much money, and what they're aiming at is something very expensive. So I think it's a mixture of radical new systems and the continued evolution. That's what's being seen at the present time.
PCDS, and then the gentleman back there.
Thank you. Gordon Messenger, Vice Chief of Defence Staff. I mean, if I can start by saying, really encouraged that this was a subject that you chose to study. It's an area that is really, really important to the future of defence if we're to survive the challenges that we face. It's down for me as one of the sort of 5 abiding qualities that that defence needs, along with sort of resilience and affordability and skills and partnerships. Innovation is right up there with them. So very encouraged that you've chosen to look at it. I do think there's a risk, just listening to this conversation, that we view this too much as a sort of capability against capability overmatch, when I think there is something much broader than that. And I'm glad that the panel did cover deterrence, because in my world, I think deterrence starts to become the lodestone around which you do prioritise your future capability. And of course that is about comparative advantage, which may be on the battlefield, but it may be strategic comparative advantage, which isn't a big nuclear weapon. It's something that is far more sophisticated than that. And innovation is at the heart of it, I would argue, firstly, because it's innovation that may yet devise the technology which gives you that offset, which is at the heart of what the Americans do. But also, frankly, if you are able to demonstrate yourself as an organisation that can innovate well, i.e. turn ideas into actions quicker than a potential adversary, the deterrent effect of that alone is significant. My question, sorry about the ramble, but it's a subject close to my heart, so I did want to make that point. My question for you is on culture, which I think is almost as important as any sort of technology or new ways of working that are thrown up through this. Because I think an organisation that has an innovative culture is going to be a successful organisation in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And without pulling your punches, and of course not remotely recognising the military conservatism point that was made, I'd be interested in your views on how the MOD can position itself at the epicentre of the community, John, that you talked about. Because you're absolutely right. This isn't just about £800 million over 10 years. This is about leveraging the private sector. It's about leveraging innovation, both in terms of IP, but in terms of funding, and the extent to which you think it needs to change, and how I'll take as much advice as I can get. How you think we should try and bring about that change, so that we have the right sort of culture to be that epicentre for this endeavour. Thank you.
John, question Then the gentleman over there.
We talk a little bit about Mariana Mazzucato's work in the paper from Sussex, and the work really talks about the myth of difference between the public and private, and good practice is good practice. Now culturally, in the innovation literature, the importance of role models and leadership has a capillary effect rather than a transactional position effect. So the idea that leadership sort of flows and moves around, I think there's something quite powerful with that as a concept rather than this kind of sense of leadership within an organisation being fixed, which I don't think works in the modern world. I think in terms of our key findings around the literature relating to innovation, I just jotted them down here, and the characteristics of that innovation is that it's networked, it's adoptive and adaptive, it self-heals and self-learns, it's critical, it's effects or outcome focused, but that's not at a fixed point. So the effect isn't on the 31st of March 2022. The effect is continually renegotiated and kind of moves as this entity moves, and all of those qualities are organic qualities rather than mechanistic qualities. I mean, that is the finding. And what's fascinating for me is those characteristics are in bucketfuls in our military. Ever read an account of anybody who's been in operations or in the SF particularly? These are the kind of qualities that these folk are talking about. That's self-learning, that's self-healing, the amorphous nature of leadership. Whoever's on point takes point. Those qualities are already in the military, and those qualities by definition are already in industry, because if people are surviving out there, then they have these qualities. So how those come together and how we use more flexible commercial processes to bring those things together, it's kind of boring stuff, but it's absolutely pivotal. And whether it's longer term contracts, whether it's the space for joint investment in the early stages of thinking about the future, thinking about capabilities with small C's, if it's thinking of looser constructs rather than firmer constructs, if it's not having a conversation about what profit we want, but range of returns, these are the things we're going to have to come to.
We have 3 more questions. I'd like snappy questions, snappy answers, please. I think I've said that before sometime. The gentleman there, then Di Havard. I'll say it again to him.
You emailed me to tell me that.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This one will be very quick. Gary Crosby, I'm Head of Research for Leonardo Airborne and Space.
Sure.
I think the enemy only looks good because they're not fighting us, first of all. But to what extent during the study did you consider the requirement to balance off the acquisition of exquisite and innovative technology with the actual physical mass that you will need to confront your peers in this peer-to-peer conflict?
We've got onto the question of mass. Who would like to? Trevor, you're looking.
Not greatly, but the way I would come to this is that it's very much a matter of what I was talking about in terms of deterrence, that you need to deal with individual situations now. So it's very different dealing with Russia, which has got a great emphasis on mass, whereas I think China presents very different sorts of problems. They're trying to downsize the size of their armed forces, but increase the sophistication. And certainly, I am one. I think, not from this study, but from our general life, we're very conscious that that exquisite technology is vulnerable to numbers, we're all conscious about how many Type 45s we have and so on, and whatever capabilities they've got, they haven't got the capability to be in 2 places at the same time. So that's a real restriction. We didn't directly investigate it in this study, but it's obviously an issue, is the extent to which the world is more interested in less expensive forms of air power. that can be deployed en masse, whether it's UAVs or but particularly UAVs or less capable combat aircraft. There's clearly a world, even the United States is interested in this. So there is a concern with numbers, but it wasn't a direct thing. But I think I think that you have to look at these in terms of both. You know, you have to look at it in terms of which particular country, which particular situation you're looking at. You know, you think about Iran and whether what kind of naval presence we have in Iran. That's a different sort of problem than dealing with Russia in Northern Europe.
Thank you for raising that question, because I think it is an absolutely central one. Di Havard, I won't say it again.
Right.
And then the lady there.
Di Havard, I'm former member of Parliament and now an individual member of RUSI. The question about what it is you should invest in and which things are absolutely important to invest in, given the American list, is a sort of question, and I was sort of mirror of the what do you dump question. The politics of access. It's interesting, I mean, you have this debate within the US currently. It's not resolved within the US. You know, President, well, he's going to have to get re-elected or start getting re-elected in 2019. Midterms 2018. We're doing the separation discussions from the EU 2019. I mean, what's the timing for this? Given that our experience with the US is things like the ITAR waiver and all of the difficulties of actually collaborating on some of these things that they say they want collaboration about. So even if we're going to have a niche capability, and we're going to be some niche capability in Secretary Work's idea of what it is, what is that going to be? But how are we actually going to get this debate? You're asking for agility. You're asking for essentially an iterative process of decision making about where we position ourselves in terms of our defence policy. We currently have a spasmodic system of defence and security views at different times. We don't have an architecture on the political side to actually deal with the questions you're asking, it seems to me. How do we develop this behavioural, cultural identity? Or how do we have a process by which decision making of the sort that you asked for can actually take place?
Andrew, would you like to take that? Well, there was a lot in there, but I think the essence of it, if I understood you, was... I think the essence of what you were talking about is how do you create a political organisational framework which allows you to take the right choices, make the right decisions. I think one of the things that we were trying to do here, and I think actually the same is true in the US, is to set out very clearly the necessity that one would hope would be the mother of invention, be that invention in technological terms, albeit invention in organisational, risk-taking, cultural terms. Because I don't think human beings, as a general rule, do much without an incentive, whether that's a positive incentive or a negative incentive. And I think one of the things that gripped us about this topic area in the first place, having done our due diligence, so to speak, over, did we believe in the third offset challenge period, and convincing ourselves that we did, was as one got further and further into the topic area, one felt that this was more and more of a compelling necessity if you wanted to remain safe and secure. So, in a minute coming up with a sort of set of solutions, we've been at this for 9 months and haven't got, to a single unified set of solutions that we're proposing. But I guess what we're really trying to do, as a paper like this should always try to do, is to feed the thinking and be a spur to a lot of people in different parts of our enterprise talking about how do you translate this sort of thing into action on the ground, be that cultural, technological, organisationally. And I think we have, whilst there are some bright spots over the years, and I certainly witnessed them firsthand when we were talking earlier about innovation in the military, I certainly witnessed that very firsthand, in Afghanistan. But that I think we need to be at the point now where the system accepts that there's a real expedient to get on with this and make those changes to organisations and cultures that are going to allow us to address this. And I don't think at this point in time that has yet happened.
Lady there.
It's EU, Council of Defence Science and Technology Australia High Commission. My question is, Dr. Andrew Taylor mentioned several times the importance of alliance to face this challenge. So in UK response, is there a clear line of efforts or line of operation of international engagement? If there is, where is it spelled out? If not, why not?
Shall I give this to a member of the audience, VCDS? I mean, that'd be a bit tough. No, okay, Trevor, you would.
I was going to say in response. I was going to say in response to Di, actually, a similar question. That actually, although cooperation with others is going to be part of this, it's not just with the United States, and I'm as aware as anybody else of the difficulties of working with the United States, and if the United States wants others to work with it, then it has to be an attractive partner. But there is, I think, regardless of Brexit, let's take Brexit out of it, but regardless of Brexit, there's an interest in working with others that have similar concerns and similar problems and have got something that they bring to the party. So that list is obviously European, but it's also Japan, it's also Australia, to a certain extent it may even be South Korea. So there are other countries that we would want to, we think the UK should, and I think the UK is exploring working with. So I don't know if that's, and is it written down? Well, we're not Ministry of Defence, it may be written down somewhere, but I think that there is some documentation on this. Yeah.
Well, it's worth saying that SDSR 15 had international by design as a core feature. Now that has a broad spectrum of interpretation, but one of the, as I understood it at least, one of the interpretations of international by design was that cooperation, collaboration and partnership with allied nations, not just on the battlefield, but also in the way that we develop our ideas and our technologies. And I think there's actually a lot of examples, leaving aside the US, which still to this day, despite the ITAR restrictions, remains our closest technological partner, and the evidence of that is everywhere to see. But we've also got some good cooperation going on with the Australians, and there are a few areas that I would point to in Australia where they really are leading the way. If you look at things like sort of battle space networking, for example, in terms of their innovation there, and completely opposite end of the spectrum, so to speak, would be the work we're doing with France at the moment on remote mine countermeasures, which is very much a key future innovation technology. So I think there's a lot of good examples of where we're cooperating with our allies, and interestingly, we've had, as we've gone through this, I think it's fair to say we've had a lot of folks from other nations, i.e. not the UK and the US, who've expressed interest in this piece of work and wanted to know more about it and to get involved in it.
John, you have 2 minutes and 2 short paragraphs.
International collaboration between the UK and Australia. We look at the submarine and the surface programme that's growing out of Adelaide now. I was there a couple of months ago. They pointed the big greenfield to me. That will be our apprentice school, and it will be there in September. Now, enabling that apprentice school is the University of Adelaide, who has a strategic relationship with the University of Southampton. Southampton has a strategic relationship with Northrop Grumman. Looking at the design function, BMT, we know that BAE Systems are sharing their understanding of how to spin submarines into the design phase for that school. A lot of this stuff is happening already. I'm not sure it's captured anywhere, but it's happening. It's completely innovative.
That was less than 2 minutes, but still 2 short paragraphs. Thank you very much indeed. I really, in the foreword to this document, I said at the end, I think this is important work, and I do think this is important work. I'm grateful to you for your contribution to this debate and for making it even more important work. I hope it helps in feeding into the debate in this short sort of new chapter of the SDSR that we're involved in this country, because we need to look at these things, and I think this work has done so very effectively. So thank you to the team, to Rusi, to you, all of you, and I think that's it. Meeting closed.